Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where in the world you are. And thank you so much for joining this edition of ThePrint's soft cover. The author is the wonderful Anirudh Suri, whose great books given me a lot of reading pleasure. Here it is. The Great Tech Game, not the Great Game, the Great Tech Game. And it's more than about just technology. It is a fantastic review of the ways in which technology has shaped our society, our planet, our political institutions, and where the world is likely to head as this other great tide of disruption sweeps over us, changing society and politics in all kinds of ways that most of us haven't thought about. The wonderful thing about Anirudh's book is that it's written in a manner that I promise will not be tedious and boring, unlike some of the other books on this topic. And I hope this conversation will be interesting as well. So I thought I'd start, Anirudh, if I may, with asking you, we're recording this on the day war has broken out in Ukraine. And it seems to be just another boring war belonging to the last century. It's about nationalism and great power spheres of influence and treaties. Is this just a relic of an old kind of age that's going to give way to something else? Or can we see some stuff here that tells us something about where our world is now headed?
Sure. No, first of all, thanks so much, Praveen, for the kind introduction and I think the wonderful description about the book. I don't think I could have done as good a job with it either. So thank you for that. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I think the Ukraine-Russia crisis that we've seen today escalate to the point where now troops and tanks seem to have gone in. Does, yes, I think at the surface look like just another war. And of course, it might not just be another war. It could potentially herald a world war, as some people are fearing. But I think ultimately it's still part of a bigger transition in the world order that I think we are undergoing currently. I think for the last couple of years, even more now, we've been seeing this battle between the US on one side and China on the other for economic dominance. And that economic dominance battle has been largely driven by who ends up being more successful in the tech world. And that's what I point out in the book as well, that today technology is the new wealth of nations. Technology is driving the economic competitiveness of nations. And as a result, I also do believe that economic prowess is the precursor for military and geopolitical influence. So today, as I see it, there's still the US and Western Europe on one side. And now Russia and China seem to have opened up two fronts for the US. Well, earlier, for the last few years, we were thinking that maybe it's just going to be the US versus China. Now it's actually, in my view, become a Russia-China front on one side, whether they're explicitly partnering or not. And on the other side, we have the US and Western Europe. So today's war, or this initiation of aggression, I would say is actually part of this bigger transition in the world order that's going on. The other piece that I'd like to mention that's pertaining to tech is that Russia has now, for the longest time, has been becoming a master of what is called the hybrid war doctrine. Right? Where it's no longer just about first sending out the tanks and the troops. For the longest time, prior to sending out those troops or the tanks, there's an information campaign, disinformation campaign going on. There's the attempt to do a lot of cyber attacks that can derail the target country's economy, financial sector, and so on and so forth. And of course, create dissent, etc., within those countries domestically, so that when you do bring in the troops, they're a lot more effective because you've effectively disarmed a lot of the opposition.
No, and just a little bit more, I think, would be really helpful to people if you could explain how Russia has used technology, not just to in this Ukraine case, but if I'm not wrong, and you mentioned some of this, through all sorts of networks which have targeted a welter of countries across the world, right? Pretty much the Baltics, even the United States.
Correct. I think the most famous example is probably the alleged influence and I'm going to use the word alleged here because a lot of this has been behind the scenes, not so established. Countries are obviously, unlike battles, a lot of these cyber attacks are happening behind the scenes by anonymous actors, which are often proxy actors as well, right? So I'm going to use the word alleged a lot, but the 2016 presidential campaign in the US obviously has been probably the most shining example of the alleged Russian capabilities in the cyber domain, right? I think that not just the US, and of course, there even the recent cyber attacks in the US, whether it was the Colonial Pipeline attack and other attacks that have happened in the US, especially on their critical infrastructure, have often been allegedly done by Russian actors or Russian-sponsored actors, as per US analysts at least, right? So I think that there's a broader capability that, of course, countries like Russia, China, and the US and others have developed today that they use very effectively to fight their battles and often end up being shorter war type attacks.
Right, and that actually serves countries like Russia, right? Because you can win without actually spending a lot of money on blowing things up or...
It'll remind you of some of the things we see in our border.
Yes, yes.
In fact, right? So in many ways, there's a lot of analogs between the kind of issues we as a country have faced sometimes on our borders, where you're not sure whether you should retaliate as if it's war, or whether you say, oh, actually, no, it's not war, so let me not get into it. Mm. So I think that piece has been going on at the global front. And then more regionally, more locally, I think that reports have suggested that in Georgia and other countries as well, in its own region, in its own neighborhood, Russia has managed to use some of these tactics to disarm and to weaken the financial sector and the economies of some of these states as a way to make them bend to their requirements. So there's actually a lot that I talk about in the book about how it's been used over the last decade.
So for me, one of the most fascinating parts of the book was, when you step back a little from where we are and look at how we got here, and you describe how we've had, if you like, multiple long duration periods of human history, which were each shaped by a technology, agriculture, industry. But all of those, I think you argue very well, had a profound effect, not just on economic production, but on our society and our culture. I think it would be great if you could talk us through that.
Yeah. So Praveen, basically the first section of the book provides that historical context that you're referring to. I believe that we've now gone through a few different great games, as I call them. The great agri game being probably the earliest one we can refer to. The great trade game, which I think we don't talk about enough, but that's a big component of what I talk about also in the book. The great colonialization and industrialization games. And more recently, the great capitalism game. All these great games, as I term them, have been the precursor to today's great game, which I call the great tech game, as the book is entitled.
Right.
All of these great games have created new winners and losers, basis which players understood the rules and the contours of the game of that era the best and were able to muster their resources to master that game. Right? So during the great agri game, for example, you'll have these big agricultural-based civilizations, India being one of them, that presumably were the most prosperous regions of those times, right? Followed by the great trading game, where trading powers, the countries that understood that now, given that trade is enriching people and regions, whoever was able to place themselves at the center of these trading routes. So you have stories about Egypt, you have stories about Yemen, you have stories about Malacca, and all of these places that were able to position themselves, Venice, etc., that were able to position themselves well in the great trading game and hence were winners.
And it wasn't necessarily that the richest was the winner, right? It was the smartest who could leverage this, their position, or, and rise from insignificance. You mentioned Venice to be colossal powers. And to me, that was very interesting.
That's right. And so I think that every game like that, and of course the colonization industrial game, we are very familiar with, where the Western European powers became the colonial as well as the industrial powers of the time, followed by capitalism, of course, where we've had the beacon of capitalism, the US, becoming the major power. And one of the arguments I make is each of these eras is creating new winners and losers, economically, geopolitically, as well as societally, right? And these great games have had a massive impact on how our society is structured, who are the elites, who are the disadvantaged groups, right? And the main lesson that I draw from that is twofold. One is that you've got to really understand the game that you're currently playing or are part of. You cannot today be sitting in the great tech game era and be playing the great industrialization game, right? That's a bad strategy as I perceive it. The other piece is from a perspective of India. India, I believe, has missed some of these great games, especially in the last 300 to 500 years. And this time around, I argue very forcefully in the book that we must not miss the boat because the implications are massive, economic, geopolitical, societal, and we don't want to end up in that position yet again. And so we've got to have a very clear game plan for how we're going to compete in this great tech game.
So I want to draw you out a little bit on this, because for the last 20 years, more or less, 25, we've been hearing that, hey, this time, the games we lost. We lost out on the Industrial Revolution. We lost out on being a global coastal trade power because of the Portuguese and the Brits. But this time we're going to crack it, and we're going to crack it because we have all these super smart techies sitting in people. But kind of looking at this, these decades in, it seems a little bit of a stuck record because we don't seem to be cracking it. And I wanted to ask you, have we really started putting the bits and pieces there? The great universities that will produce fantastic chip building engineers or pure mathematics PhDs, all these, are we building the foundations for this properly?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think that strikes at the core of how India should be thinking about this great tech game and coming out ahead in it. I think, during the colonial era, we were shackled by a lot of the structures that were put in by the colonial power at the time. So even if we had the talent that time or the resources, we were not able to compete fairly on an even keel with some of the colonial powers, I think, as we are all familiar with. This time around, what's different is that I think that we don't have those kind of structural shackles around us that are preventing us from the outside. I think domestically now we are very strong in terms of talent. The other key component that we need is capital. And I think we're increasingly linking ourselves to the global capital flows, at least in the technology world, which I've been part of for the last decade. So I think the talent piece, the capital piece, those two pieces, I think are coming together. But there's a couple of other pieces that are also needed, right? And policy and strategy, I believe, is that missing piece today, right? That we still have a lot to figure out on. I believe that we are today very well positioned, but that does not guarantee that we'll end up a winner.
That's an important point. So you can have great cards in your hand. If I can give an example that certainly all the Delhi people here will understand. You can have a fantastic hand of 3 cards, but you can still end up losing a lot of money, right?
That's right. Especially with around Diwali, yes. That's right. So I think that there's obviously the research piece which you alluded to, which is a very important piece in this. We have largely been seen as, and we also often sometimes pride ourselves on being a talent nation. But I believe that what we need today is to be a tech nation. And for that, besides the talent and capital that we've spoken about already, the core IP, the core tech, that is actually driven by the original science-based research that your universities and researchers will do, that piece I think we're still lagging in. So I think we do have to transition in our heads, in our perception for the outside world, but also in our own strategy. We have to move ourselves from being just a talent nation, a provider of human capital to the world, to actually being a tech nation where we own and develop a lot of the core tech IP, because ultimately that's where the money is. I'll give you a very clear example, right? So Apple and Google, why are they trillion-dollar companies? They're also technically just building apps, right? From what many of us think. But actually, the reason they make so much money is that they are playing in the core infrastructure layer of tech. They own the operating systems. Apple owns the iOS, Google owns Android.
Right.
And a lot of their royalties, their money is derived from these businesses, of course, in addition to advertising and other pieces. But that's also a function of them owning that infrastructure layer. Today, India doesn't own a lot of that infrastructure, right? And so while we pride ourselves on having unicorns, which are largely apps, which is the application layer, we must start building the infrastructure layer as well and playing in that.
So tell me, as someone in this field, I know you've had a lot of conversations with policymakers, with political leaders. You've tried to push people to think about these things. What do you say to them, and where do you think the problem is? Why haven't we been able to, do this fast enough or robustly enough?
See, I think there are a couple of things that, as I said, we've done very well, and there are a couple of things that we need to do much better. The core tech research piece, we really need to do better. Traditionally, R&D spending for India has been very, very low compared to countries like the China, the US, European Union, and even some other developing countries.
And that's government spending, right? That doesn't come from private investors. That
both. Ultimately, R&D is a function of both government-sponsored research as well as private sector doing its own set of research. Of course, the government can incentivize and push the private sector to do even more, but it's not just one or the other. Both the private sector and the government have to increase their spending on R&D, original R&D. We're seeing some signs in the healthcare and bio sector, of course, the pharma sector a little bit there, and even some in the tech sector. But I believe a lot more has to be done, which is actually just a strategic decision, right? The resources are there. We have large companies, tech companies, as well as others that are sitting on massive piles of cash on their balance sheets. They could choose to invest that into R&D, or they could choose to invest that in, let's say, M&A activity, acquisitions of companies. Now, it's a choice. It's a strategic choice they are making. I think that they need to start thinking a lot more strategically, at least in the tech era, about investing in R&D, because that's where you lock in long-term sustainable moats to have massive profitability on your businesses. Similarly, on the government side, there has to be a lot more quality research coming out of our institutions. Not to say there isn't already, there is. But I think one piece that could be improved there is that today, I believe, from my understanding, having spoken to a lot of people in the university setting as well as the business world, is that a lot of the research that is happening in our research institutions today is what they believe should be researched. Whereas the right here is the private sector should say, this is the problem I want to solve. This is where I believe big corporate growth and profits are to be made. Let's say it's vaccines, or let's say it's some new tech architecture in the Web3 world we are living in now. And then let the research institutions supply that demand that's coming from the private sector. I think that kind of model where the private sector demands and the public research institutions supply, I think is the best model that other countries have followed. The US is again a very good example of that, where the private sector gets universities like the MITs of the world to do a lot of the research that they believe is important to be done.
Right. And, even in the case, in the course of the pandemic, we saw the United States government working with the private sector to get these vaccines developed rapidly. They didn't say, oh, we need a government lab and we need a something and a something. They said, here's the money, now go do it. And there are incentives for doing it.
That's right.
No, absolutely. I want to flesh out something you said about our tech world. The signs of some kinds of pretty fundamental changes are there. I mean, the fact that we are having this conversation, I look back to the beginning of my career when you used to have to bribe this guy in the post office with half a bottle of rum to send your stories on the telex machine, because there was, and there was no way of making a phone call. And here we are, not all actually in the scheme of history that much longer having this conversation.
Yeah.
What does this mean for societies? What does this mean for the ways in which societies work? What does it mean for work? What does it mean for the family? And you have some interesting observations, thoughts on these questions.
Yeah. So one of the analogs I've drawn in the book pertaining to this particular question is I've gone back to the industrial era and even the agri era to see how did those eras impact, or how did agriculture or the rise of agriculture and the rise of industrial technology shape our society. And I tried to derive clues from there to suggest how this might evolve in the current great tech game. If you look back at the industrial era, of course, you find that we went from joint families and people much more spread out physically to getting concentrated into cities and becoming nuclear families. And that's, of course, I think it's obvious the kind of impact it's had on societies and families and marriages and the number of kids you're having and so on and so forth.
Sure.
And it's also had a clear impact on our ecology, right? On the environmental impact of industrialization is, I think, something now we've become intimately familiar with, but also very, very adversely impacted by, right? So I think if you draw some of those analogs to today's era, the great tech game is similarly shaping our societies today. The impact will not be, of course, one-to-one. It'll be very different. And it's hard for me to list out, these are the 10 things that will happen in the future, but you're seeing some signs. So, for example, you talked about work. The future of work is becoming increasingly so different, right? Today, you and I could be sitting anywhere in the world having this conversation. I don't have to tell you that, Zoom calls and Zoom meetings have become the norms now. So in a way, and we've seen this in the tech world, there's again a deconcentration of cities that might get unleashed. We've had a lot of tech entrepreneurs, most famously Sridhar Vembu of Zoho Corporation, who's moved out to a village.
That's fascinating because he thought the quality of life was superior.
Company from there.
Right.
So you no longer necessarily need to be in a concentrated, congested city. So the moment now this happens, where people now start spreading back out into the countryside and start becoming productive from there, as productive as they would be in a city, you'll again start to see a massive shift in the kind of nature of urbanization that we're likely to see. So I think that we might end up with fewer mega metropolises like Delhi and a lot more smaller towns, which will still have the same creature comforts that we've become used to in cities, but will be much more livable, much more sustainable.
And that's a sort of very optimistic vision of the future, particularly in an age when every big city is in some degree of environmental crisis in terms of the air we breathe, the water we drink. I mean, this wonderful enhancement in our prosperity over the last couple of centuries is actually at a kind of impasse right now where we're all wondering whether this has actually made our lives better. And I wanted to ask you about climate, because that's another of the big issues you've flagged in this book. Is technology going to finally crack the problem of climate change by reducing cities, by letting us use hydrocarbons more efficiently, by transitioning us to new energy forms? And what are the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about as we make this switch?
Yeah. So I think that's probably the most important question to think about and I think discuss as a society and as a nation for us today, and of course as a world. I think the choices that we made during the industrial era, the energy choices specifically, were definitely not taking into account the ecological impact of those energy choices. That time, scale, efficiency, low-cost production, scale, these were the things that the industrial powers of the day optimized for. In a way, technology was to blame for those.
Yes, and given the times, given what they knew, that these were not unreasonable choices.
That's right. And of course, that awareness has unfolded over the years. But in today's world, now the lesson to be learned from that time is, as we transition into this great tech game that I talk about, we are now again faced with a new set of energy-related choices. So one point I make in the book very forcefully is that we must be a lot more mindful about the energy choices we are making today as we start to move production into a lot more tech-driven production. We must be careful when we talk about cryptocurrencies and bitcoins. There's a lot of talk around the energy impact of mining bitcoins as well. We must not ignore that.
Yeah, it's basically that it consumes a gargantuan amount of electricity.
That's right.
To mine these things, and all of that is carbon going into the air somewhere.
That's right. And even with artificial intelligence, when you have these massive supercomputers running and processing massive gigatons of data, there's an energy cost related to that. Data centers that we are now filling up the world with because we want to supply faster and faster internet, and we don't want our Netflix movies to be buffering like in yesteryear. The result is data centers. Now, of course, we can have clean energy driven data centers, but we must do that from the get-go. These kind of energy choices must be made from the get-go. The second piece where tech comes in here is climate tech is increasingly becoming a big field of innovation in itself. So there's a lot of climate tech startups that have come up that are not internet tech startups now, they are climate tech startups that are saying, okay, how are we going to leverage any and all technologies available out there to improve our carbon footprint, capture carbon from the atmosphere where we can, and of course help in better choices going forward. I'll give you a very clear statistic. 60 to 70% of the construction in India by 2050 has not happened yet.
Wow. It hasn't even begun.
Hasn't happened yet. The construction that we will have in 2050 as a country, 60 to 70% of that has not happened yet. So now it's up to us to say, do we want to make more energy efficient buildings the norm straight away? Or do we want to wait 20 years? Because once that construction is done in an energy inefficient way, we're going to have to live with those buildings in construction for another 30, 40 years.
Right. So a simple choice like office building being insulated better to save air conditioning costs turns into a huge saving in our carbon footprint.
That's exactly right. And I think hence technology is not going to be the only source of the solution for the climate problem. Ultimately, it's human behavior, how much we are willing to change, think about it, and clarify what kind of strategy and what kind of values we want to emphasize as we build the new economic structures, the new physical structures, etc. So I think our human behavior, the choices we make are going to play as important a role as the technological innovation.
So a final question, Anirudh, which is, as we make this enormous transition, and your book is part of this, but obviously it involves, from everything you're saying, people making some fundamental choices about the way they want to live and what they want to be as societies.
Correct.
How do you enable this conversation on a larger scale? And given that a large chunk of India is simply cut off from this conversation, yes. How do you evolve a consensus around it?
Great. So two questions. One is to how to start and kickstart the conversation, and second is how to develop a consensus around it. And the second part is going to be much harder. See, how to ensure that there's a much broader conversation about this. I think my book is, of course, one effort towards that, but we need so much more. We need the government talking about it. We need the private sector, especially the tech sector, to enable those kind of choices into the design of the technology that we are producing. We cannot say that technology will get designed, products will get designed, keeping in mind that we want to have as much time on the screen by as many consumers in the world. The moment you've set that as your business objective in the tech world, you are doomed. Because companies today are very good at hooking you, right? So I think that design choices being made in the tech world also have to be improved. We must, and you've seen probably if you are on Instagram and a few of the other social media apps now, there are these 10-minute, 20-minute, 30-minute warning pop-ups that you can set up.
Right. And I don't think there's a family in the world right now, at least a middle-class one, that doesn't worry its kids are constantly distracted, that we don't talk to each other, we don't communicate, we're staring at these damn things all the time.
Exactly. And this conversation has to also go into the tech companies that are designing these products and the business models that they are adopting and that are being funded. The moment you have a business model that is being funded, that is sustaining only on more and more and more time on the screen, which is obviously taking away from our lives also, you'll continue to have this problem. But now there's a very interesting trend happening in the tech world under this Web3 movement where we are saying, let's try and move away from this advertising-driven revenue models in the tech world, which are causing a lot of that hooking and getting people to stay on the screen, to other revenue models and business models that do not cause so much distraction. So it's these kinds of efforts, I think, again, across society that will have to happen. Tech leaders should be doing it. Our government leaders should be doing it. Our teachers and schools should be doing it. Us as parents, obviously, we should be doing it. And as I mentioned in the book, I see our engagement with tech as a new life skill, like swimming or driving, etc.
Right.
We must teach our children also as responsible parents, I think. Just the way we teach them how to drive responsibly and safely or how to swim well, we must teach them how to use technology well for their wellness, not to end up with digital, addictions and depression and just over-reliance on technology. Ultimately, I think I mentioned this in the book, I'm a tech realist. I don't believe that tech is the answer for everything. I'm not a tech optimist. I'm not a tech pessimist either who believes that tech will destroy
us all.
Right? Or that we should be terribly scared of everything that's new age tech. No, I believe I'm a very tech realist kind of person who believes that tech is there. It's going to have a massive impact. But we must learn how to deal with it and how to shape tech. Just the way tech is shaping us, we must learn how to shape tech to be in sync with the values that we value most as a family, as an individual, as a society, as a nation.
So I'll just close by saying, Anirudh, that what I think was really exciting about this book and this conversation for me is we sometimes forget, but a lot of the gains of the Industrial Revolution, clean drinking water, safe mass transit, reduced fatalities from disease, came about because of books and conversations like this, because people in the private sector, capitalists, people in government, and people like everyone watching this program, conversations that they started having with each other about what a better world would look like and how you could go about doing it. And I fear we don't have nearly enough of those conversations. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you today. And thank you all for watching this episode of ThePrint Softcover. And once again, this is just to say, this is one of the most... I wish we lived in slightly happier times and I got Anirudh here to sign a copy, but soon there will be better days. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, Anirudh, for making the time.
Thank you so much, Praveen, and thank you to ThePrint. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Great, Anirudh. I'll just get these guys to close it off for us, and let's catch up for a coffee or something whenever you have some spare time.
I would love that. I would love that. I think anytime over after the next week or two, I would love to. I didn't mention yesterday, but one of my very early memories of your work, I have to share with you.
Now you're making me feel old, yeah, so stop it.
No. I have enough gray hair on my beard. One of my earlier college internships was with a think tank called IPCS.
Okay.
And I went to Kashmir for a summer after my freshman year of college. Spent the entire summer there. And that's when I first came across your work.
Anirudh, what on earth led you from think tank thing to tech? That's a really unusual journey. And I know a bunch of IPCS people, nobody who's gone boom.
Yeah, so actually, it's been a very all over the place type of journey, but it's been fun. I think I spent a lot of time in the think tank world during my college years. IPCS, Carnegie, I interned with. Worked with Ashley Tellis and George Berkovich.
Oh, wow, okay. Ashley's an old friend, huh?
Yeah, so he was my mentor during that internship, and then I ended up working as a fellow also at Carnegie post college. But when the US-India nuclear deal was happening, and those were
Really
obviously very exciting. But even in college, I'd had a dual focus on economics on one side and international relations on the other, and I'd been feeding off on my IR work at these think tanks, right? But I also had a very strong interest on the economic and business side, and so I ended up working with McKinsey right after Carnegie. In fact, I deferred my McKinsey job to go work at Carnegie for some time because I was obviously very interested in that with Ashley and George and others. And then just one thing led to the other. I ended up doing an MBA and a master's in public administration. So I kept that dual hat on for a while. And then after some time, I had to make a choice. And so I ended up going into the tech world, in the venture capital startup world. And, to be honest, I mean, I don't want to say luckily or not, but in a way, luckily for me at least, the tech world has collided with the policy world in a way has made it very easy for me to keep both of my interests and both of my, past worlds or past experiences and bring them to intersect now. So, in a way, that's the result. The book is a result of that dual interest in tech on one side now from a business and venture standpoint, and policy, foreign policy, and economic policy on the other.
No, but I can see the book's been a fuckload of work. I mean, that reference list is clearly you've been thinking about this for quite some time.
I have. And in a way, like it's been actually a pleasure for me, to be honest, to have been able to take this time over the last year. COVID, to be honest, has also enabled this a little bit, where a lot of us have been able to step back, right? So for me, actually, it's helped me digest and make sense of a lot of the things that were, always brewing in the back of my head, whether it was foreign policy or geopolitics related or tech and economic competitiveness. I was always thinking, okay, how can India compete truly, right? Having worked around the world, you always have this in the back of your mind. How can India actually truly compete in the world economically and not just be stuck in some of the older games that I feel we continue to be stuck in?
No, we've really, I fear sometimes, honestly, that we're on the cusp of missing the bus. The clock is ticking. Let's put it that way.
And a friend of mine earlier today, I was talking to, having lunch with, he was saying, how should India play on this Russia, China, US thing? And I said, listen, ultimately all we need to think about is keep our heads focused on the tech game. That's your ticket to economic growth and economic prosperity. Ultimately, that drives, in my view, everything else, right? And we should not get too locked into like other battles and other domains quite yet. I think much like China did, right? For 20 years, they were like economic growth, economic growth, economic growth. I think for the next 20 years, India should be tech as my ticket to economic growth because that's where I'm best placed.
I keep saying this and some people get upset, but I've written it time and time again that our strategic goal is, not reoccupying Pakistan, occupied Kashmir or Aksai Chin. Our strategic goal is as close as we can get to double-digit growth for as long as we can get.
As long as possible. And as broad-based
as possible. Yeah. And all the rest is trivial. I mean, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah. And a lot of the pieces are there. One of the things we didn't talk about is this whole India digital infrastructure story, right? This UPI, Aadhaar, a bunch of these things. These are, truly forming a layer that can become an operating system layer from India's standpoint. And you can have companies, and I talk about this briefly in the book, you can have companies that build out this digital OS, as I call it, the digital operating system for the world. Right? But government should not do it. They should take this architecture and put on apps like Apple has put on apps in its marketplace on that OS and go and sell this globally. And that's how you can actually get sticky profits and defendable.
This is where, all these conversations ultimately come around to this because our system is just loath to let people, run with it. There is this compulsive need to control things.
Yeah.
And it always costs us. Yeah, it just always costs us.
It does. Yeah. That kind of control has to be given up and shared. If not given up, it has to be shared.
Part of it is also this reflexive fear, because we've been a poor society for a long time, and that suspicion is there in everyone's mind कि यार इसको करने दूँ तो साला पैसे खाएगा. But the costs of not letting him do it far outweigh anything he is going to, swipe or scan.
When larger companies form, unless they are, certain kind of structure, they end up sharing the wealth in direct and indirect ways, right? So if you have a large company where you've created now, let's say 5 billionaires in the tech world, ultimately, what are they going to do with their wealth?
Spend it, yeah.
Incentives and the right structures in place, they'll invest that wealth into entrepreneurs in India, businesses in India. But if you don't, then a lot of that wealth will go out and get invested in the US stock market or the Singaporean stock market and so on and so forth. But if you make your country an attractive destination, then a lot of that wealth that has been created will go back. And if that wealth, one of the things I haven't written, which has struck me later, is that one of the reasons I think the Mughal, and again, this is not substantiated, I'm not a historian, but it's just a hypothesis in my head. One of the problems I think in the Mughal era and that era, in the feudal/Mughal era that we've had, is there was a lot of wealth that got locked into unproductive assets.
Yeah. In fact, one other thing Manucci said, Manucci looked at the Mughal court and said, these guys are fabulously wealthy. Why are they not having an industrial revolution?
Exactly. If they had said that instead of...
and it was, again, that policy stuff. They never cracked a functional taxation regime. They never saw the need to have private ownership of land. So everything was owned by the court. It was the little things ultimately which nobody even talked about or paid attention to. They unlock so much.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And today I still worry. Like one of the tweets I put out recently, someone had talked about how much gold we hold, right? And of course, land and gold. Those are assets that are, of course, they can appreciate, but they're not productive assets. They don't have trickle-down effects on the economy, ultimately.
It's fear-driven. Now you're always scared that there are bad times lurking around the corner. So you want to lock your money in. And that's where government and policy comes in to address that sense of fear, because there's no point calling on me to be personally brave with my money. I'm not.
You can't be the single fool in the company. That's right. You can't be alone as a fool. Correct.
Anyway, take care, Anirudh. We'll catch up one of these days. Thank you.